What's going on, people? I am dukedobbins for the win, and as I've covered in past videos, following the release of the Taken King expansion pack and its accompanying title update, Destiny will be a vastly different game, and not just because of new Taken King content, but because of the way they are fundamentally changing the base game and the first two expansions. And as I argued in my previous Destiny video, I can't help but feel like year one Destiny was just a giant beta. And today I want to take a look at that concept, that the first year of Destiny was a beta, in the context of a widely used business strategy that may explain why Bungie felt compelled to run year one Destiny in this way. I want to talk about minimum viable products. Now, a minimum viable product has just those core features that allow the product to be deployed, and no more. The product is typically deployed to a subset of possible customers, such as early adopters, that are thought to be more forgiving, more likely to give feedback, and able to grasp a product vision from an early prototype or marketing information. It is a strategy targeted at avoiding building products that customers do not want, that seeks to maximize the information learned about the customer per dollar spent. The minimum viable product is that version of a new product which allows a team to collect the maximum amount of validated learning about customers with the least effort. I would argue there's plenty of evidence to suggest that Destiny was released as a minimum viable product. It had only the core features that allowed it to be deployed, right? It had gameplay but no story. It had a shared world shooter environment but no way for anyone to actually interact in that shared world, thus defeating the entire purpose of the shared world. It had pretty fun multiplayer, but it only had 4 PvP modes, and they were all TDM variants. It shipped with the bare minimum amount of content. It is deployed to a subset of customers, such as early adopters who are thought to be more forgiving of a product's shortcomings, aka people who pre-ordered the game, many of whom still defend the game and its many shortcomings to the death to this day. The strategy is targeted at avoiding building products that customers do not want. So this is the important part, right? Bungie doesn't want to spend all this time and money developing their ultimate vision of what Destiny should be, only to find out that you, the customer, ultimately disagree with that vision, because that would be a waste of money. Now, some people might argue this is smart. I would argue that it's cowardly and intellectually bankrupt. And in fact, it could be even smaller than their overall vision. They don't want to waste money building any feature that isn't going to be worth the investment in terms of how many players see their average play times increased by said features, right? They don't want to spend a ridiculous amount of time and effort developing, sparrow racing, or player-owned houses, or like a custom camo paint shop for your ship, only to find out that one or all of those things fell flat with the player, or maybe just didn't do much to keep them on the game longer than they would have been on the game anyways without that feature, right? So like, I'm sure, we all say, oh, okay, well, it would be really cool if we could design custom paint jobs for our ships. But the question on Bungie's end is, does that actually keep us on the game longer? Are we actually playing the game longer? Is that actually selling more copies? Is that something that's, traveling through word of mouth and inspiring people to buy more copies? So it's not just their overall vision. They want to avoid any feature that isn't going to see a return on the investment of the time and money put into that feature, right? So before they spend time or money on any feature, they want to figure out exactly what the customer wants, what we, the Destiny players, want, while wasting the least amount of resources in pursuit of that information. Now, what Bungie wants to avoid is what we saw happen with Star Wars The Old Republic, right? That's that MMO Knights of the Old Republic game. I was very excited about that game. I was a big Knights of the Old Republic fan. And I was one of the people who wanted a Knights of the Republic MMO, and then they came out with it, but it kind of fell flat. This game had one of the highest development costs of all time, okay? This game has been estimated to have cost more to develop than Grand Theft Auto 5 and Modern Warfare 2 and even Destiny itself. And it hasn't been a flop, it's online, it still has a dedicated fan base, but obviously it was never anywhere near as popular or commercially successful as something like GTA 5 or Modern Warfare 2 or Destiny. Indeed, less than a year after launching, they had to adopt a free-to-play business model. That's basically the equivalent of a new game having to put itself on sale, because we can sell this game, but not at our asking price. The customer doesn't think it's worth what we think it's worth, which means we're not seeing the return on investment we wanted, right? So what went wrong with this game is that they poured a massive amount of resources into the story. I remember following this game before it came out. This was their primary selling point. That was what they wanted to set this game apart from other MMOs, was its deep and immersive story. They wanted to have interesting conversation mechanics where multiple players can be entering dialogue options and conversations with multiple NPCs at once. They wanted great writing and the best voice acting. In fact, they have a Guinness World Record for the largest entertainment voiceover project ever, with over 200,000 lines of recorded dialogue. This decision was probably influenced by the fact that KOTOR's, the original Knights of the Old Republic games, their success was widely attributed to their awesome storylines, right? But ultimately that didn't seem to do the trick for most fans. Again, you don't put that kind of money into a project just looking to break even. It's because you want a game as big as what GTA 5 and Destiny have been. But Tor was never that. And you certainly don't expect to see a game that has that expensive of a development cost free to play less than a year after release. And so this is a textbook example of building this huge expensive feature that ultimately did not see a satisfactory return on investment. Now, as someone who followed that game closely and was disappointed by it, and I was a part of the community at the time, I was following the forum, seeing, what people were saying and whatnot, I kind of have a general sense of why fans weren't really feeling it. The story was really cool, but it had no endgame content, or very little endgame content at the time of its release. And in fact, the way the developers themselves suggested playing the game was you play through the story on one character and then start a new character and play through the story on that, right? And they have all these different classes and characters. But that's not how people want to play an MMO. Most people have their main character, right? And they get attached to it and they want to pursue endgame content and really grow that one character. So very little endgame content, very poor graphics. I mean, graphics that looked worse than the original Knights of the Old Republic games. And this was coming out, in 2011 or what have you. It also had very few features outside of its narrative appeal that made it stand out from any other generic MMO, right? Outside of the story, there was nothing that really separated it from different MMOs that were arguably better, like World of Warcraft. So looking back on it, that game would have been a lot more successful had they taken all the time and resources they put into the story and hiring voice actors and writers, and instead spent that time and resources on graphics or new mechanics or what have you. The great story it had, and its awesome, innovative narrative mechanics, they were cool, but ultimately not enough to attract and retain the amount of customers it was supposed to.
Frags out, motherfuckers!
BioWare invested heavily into this feature, and although I'm sure they turned a profit on the game, they did not get the returns on investment they were looking for with that particular feature. And this is what I would speculate Bungie was afraid of, is doing something similar to what Star Wars did, where they put this massive amount of resources into a particular feature, a particular type of gameplay, only to find out that that feature isn't resonating with the player base strongly enough to justify its price tag. You see what I'm saying? Activision and or Bungie wants to make sure that every dollar spent sees a return on investment. So how do you avoid what happened to the Old Republic? And keeping in mind that they're really entering uncharted waters here, right? The shared world shooter, it really is kind of a new concept, trying to combine the best parts of an FPS and an MMO. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of room for error. So how do you avoid what happened to the Old Republic? You have to test the game a lot, right? You have to see what works and what doesn't, what the players like and don't like. Now, you can release a beta, but you can't include the full game in the beta because then you're just giving away your game for free. People finish the game during the beta, don't feel the need to buy it at release. But if they can't access the full game, they can't test the whole game. And in the case of Destiny, if people had access to the full game during the beta, I guarantee you a good chunk of them would have canceled their pre-orders. Alternatively, Bungie can run focus groups, right, where they get a group of people in their target demographics, they put them in a room, in-house, have them play the game, and then fucking tell you what they thought about them, right? But that shit costs a lot of money. You gotta hire professional researchers to conduct these groups and interpret the data. A lot of the time you have to pay the testers themselves, and then you gotta rehire all these people to retest every little change you make. That's the big thing. So okay, the focus group didn't like this, so we tweaked it. But now we got a focus group test it again. Oh, they didn't like our tweaking it. They didn't like the way we tweaked it. They didn't like that shit either. Now we gotta do it a third time. Costs that much more money, plus it takes that much more time. However, if you've already released the game, you put out an update, the players test it for you for free, you have a huge pool of people testing it, making it that much more accurate, and you'll have all the feedback you need within like 24 hours. You have a faster, higher quality system for testing your product, and it's free. And like I was saying, I'm sure there's a lot of stuff they had to test. I'm sure there was a lot of uncertainty. You know, are they pursuing FPS players or MMO players? How do they reconcile the different preferences of these two different kinds of players? What level of simplicity should they be trying to achieve? What average age of player is going to enjoy this game? How do they reconcile the different gameplay preferences of all the different age groups, from 10 years old to the dads of Destiny? What makes a shared world shooter appealing? What kind of mechanics work in that environment and what kind don't? It's a new kind of game. There's a lot of shit that needs to be tested, and they can either take a giant stab in the dark and put all their resources into the game and develop it based on assumptions or on the ideas and vision of the developers, which is sort of the traditional method. But that won't achieve the highest return on investment per dollar spent. It's better and safer to let the player decide specifically what kind of game and features they want and then build it around that. One of the popular mottos you'll hear in Silicon Valley, the heart of the tech industry, right, is that you should fail often, fail quickly, and fail forward. The more you fail, the better your product will be. You see what doesn't work. You see what features were a waste of resources. Now, the faster you fail, the faster your product gets better. So the traditional product feedback cycle we saw in gaming up until very recently consisted of making a game, getting feedback from the game, and then making changes based on that feedback in the sequel. For example, in Halo 2, everyone agrees that the rocket launcher lock-on mechanism is way too powerful, so they take that feature out in Halo 3. In the past, the typical feedback cycle consisted of sequels improving on their predecessors based on the feedback those predecessors received. But that's a slow feedback cycle. It takes years to implement the changes you've seen based on feedback, and God forbid the changes you made should be received negatively, because then you have to wait another year or two to adapt the product to the feedback you received for that change, right? It's a slow-ass feedback loop. And so the product improves much slower. It reaches perfection that much slower. But now, with the rise of post-launch game updates, and with everyone almost always being connected to the internet, developers can literally develop the game in real time with real-time feedback. Destiny releases. It's a beta build. The fan base has significant complaints about the loot and progression system, so they make significant changes in the Dark Below. We have problems with that shit too, so they make new changes with the House of Wolves. It's better, but we still have some issues with that shit too. Now with the Taken King, they're making the biggest changes to the loot and progression systems we've seen so far. They're fine-tuning and adjusting the shit based on the feedback they get with every new expansion. And then there are 2 more expansions coming out after the Taken King, right? And then they have the entire thing perfected by the time Destiny 2 comes out. And so in the past, what might have taken 2 to 3 games of feedback and changes over the course of several years has now been accomplished over the course of 2 or 3 expansions in 1 year. But of course, the elephant in the room is this. Is this type of business model ultimately positive or negative for the consumer? Because on the one hand, in theory, we get a perfected product that much faster. But at the same time, we are having to spend an awful lot of money to essentially beta test this game for them. The developer has passed on the costs of game testing to the consumer. Instead of spending the time and resources to test their own game, they have us pay them to do it. It's a tricky question that I suspect might vary from game to game. But one thing I do feel comfortable arguing is that you should wait to buy the Taken King. Let other people beta test the shit for you, and then you can buy the superior product later on at a significantly reduced price. Furthermore, there is one thing that the developer and the consumer can agree on here. And that is that we both want to move through this feedback loop and get to the perfected product as quickly as possible. The publisher, the developer, and the consumer all benefit from a faster and more accurate feedback loop. So what can we, the people, Destiny players and consumers, do to speed up the rate of feedback and hold that feedback to a higher degree of accuracy and thus reach a perfected product that much faster? We can bitch. You know, it's funny, a lot of the things I've bitched about on this channel in regards to the grinding and use of recycled content and such are now being fixed. And the very same people who bitched at me for bitching about stuff are now happy that the shit I bitched about got fixed. And that's not to suggest that I by myself am the reason this shit is getting changed. A lot of other people bitched about the same shit, but it is being changed because of people bitching. So look, I see a lot of kids asking, well, Batman, if you don't like the game, don't play it. Why even make a video bitching about it? What's the point? Because sometimes bringing attention to an issue, registering a complaint, letting the powers that be know that you're pissed off about something will oftentimes result in the problem getting fucking solved, son. So in the future, we need to bitch louder and harder and much more often. So then later on in Destiny 2 or whatever, we don't end up in the same position so many of us year 1 players are in now, where we got a significantly watered down version of the game for 5 times the price that the full game eventually ended up being sold for. We can't let companies make a profit off of us like that. I've said it a million times, I'll say it a million times more. Business, deal making, the art of the deal is about a competition between the business and the customers, much like a game of basketball, except everybody's money is on the line. Activision has had a great first half. For the sake of our wallets and the quality of the products we consume, we cannot let them win this game. At the end of the day, this is just about the gamer class, we the people, making and saving more money. It's about negotiating a better deal with Activision. Now, we can't negotiate face-to-face, one-on-one. In that earlier video, I argued that in place of that, we can wait to buy the Taken King, which obviously I still recommend you do, but the next, even more effective tactic is for every player to collectively bitch and moan as often as possible. Be reasonable, but be critical. These guys are making bank off your ass. You don't need to worry about hurting their feelings. And don't be afraid to be passionate about expressing your distaste for certain aspects of the game. They want this feedback. It's a part of their business model. If a simple majority of Destiny players bitch about a deal, Activision gives in. That's what we saw with the Collector's Edition controversy, right? If we bitch enough about specific shortcomings of a game's content, we see Bungie address those issues, which is the case with basically every change they are about to make to the base game with the Taken King title update. Now, granted, neither of those concessions went far enough. We should be getting those 3 dance move shaders and class items for $5, not $20, and putting a story in the game a year after launch is already a year too late than it should be. But that's because not enough people were complaining, and those who weren't complaining loudly enough. This was a 6 out of 10 game, and it's not just GameSpot and Polygon and myself who feel that way. I feel like Bungie themselves is admitting that with all the changes they are making. These are significant revisions that essentially admit that their previous iterations were counterproductive, lacking, and not up to par. So why was a 6 out of 10 game the most commercially successful game of the year? Because this game had more pre-orders than most other games' total sales. And if we allow them to cut these same corners with Destiny 2, then we can't be surprised when that game ends up being a 6 out of 10 overhyped, massive disappointment, the same way the original has been. The best way to keep them honest is to very vocally critique the shit out of their work as often as possible. Talk to your friends, bring up your complaints in your game parties, get involved on forums, take the fight to the circle jerk that is the Destiny Reddit and Bungie.net forums, make a video, tweet it at me. If it's good, I'll retweet it. Start some shit in the comment section of whatever Facebook post, whatever YouTube video, find someone you disagree with and tell them why. That's what the fuck I do, and it's working out pretty well for me. And that starts with the Taken King. Even if you think it's a 9 out of 10 piece of content, find that last point and make a big fucking deal about it. If Destiny 2 ends up being like a 7 out of 10 or less game, like what we saw with the base game, just remember that this is Bungie. It's not 7 out of 10 because they didn't have the talent or resources to make it a perfect piece of content. It's because they found a clever way to make 7 out of 10 more profitable, and that's what went so terribly wrong with this game in the first place. The For the Win query of the day is what changes or what additions, what content additions, what do you want to see in future Destiny games or future Destiny DLC? Please be sure to rate the video if you enjoyed it. This is Batman signing out.